So this is a view of the brain from the side. We call this sagittal, S-A-G-I-T-T-A-L. And so when we do an MR scan of a patient, we will scan in different planes. We can do it as if it was parallel to the floor here, and that's called axial. We can do it like it's going from right to left, that's called sagittal. And we can do it in this plane, like slicing from front to back, and that's called coronal, like crown. Okay. So here is a sagittal view of the brain. And what you're seeing here, this is the frontal lobe, and this is the temporal lobe. And if you look carefully, you can see the temporal lobe has basically like 3 divisions here. And so these bumps on the surface are called gyri, singular gyrus. And then there are slit-like things in between them, and those are called sulci. And so one of the things to learn brain anatomy is, over the centuries, people have tried to understand what is this gyrus for, and what is that gyrus for. And it's using pretty crude techniques. People were able to figure out what part of the brain was involved with a particular function. A famous example is an individual named Phineas Gage, who worked on, have you heard of him? Yeah. Okay. How did you guys hear about Phineas Gage?
I read a book on him.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Okay. So what was the point of that?
He was working on a railroad,
right?
And there was an explosion in one of the mines, and a steel rod came up through his jaw, through his head, but he survived.
Right.
So.
And what did they learn from that? I mean,
well, they said like certain parts of the brain like function even without like key parts that coming out with the steel rod.
Right. So they figured. Go ahead.
But then there's personality disorders as well.
Right. Right. So they figured out. They asked, now what is different about Gage now that this area of the brain has been affected? So now we're showing more of the frontal lobe. We're seeing part of the brain here that's in the back, the parietal lobe. We still see a little bit of the temporal lobe, and now we're seeing the structure that's behind the brainstem, and this is the cerebellum. So to put it very simply, because we'll make it more complicated later, the frontal lobe is involved in a number of cognitive functions. Not just thinking like, oh, you know, I have to catch the train, but there's a portion of the frontal lobe that is involved in decision making and in suppression of impulses. So an animal, if you put a bowl of food in front of a dog, it usually cannot suppress the urge to go over to eat the food. Luckily, humans are able to suppress urges. And there are times when we don't need to suppress them or want to, but there are lots of times when to live in society, we have to suppress urges. You know, you don't go running after a friend who you see across the street if there's traffic coming. You have to say, you know, there's a part of you that says, don't run now, wait until the light, or wait until there's no traffic. So that's an important part of the frontal lobe, to be able to put a brake on mechanisms.
Is that like the location of willpower?
Yeah, that's a good way to think of it, yeah.
So is the frontal lobe part of the prefrontal cortex in that sense, or is it?
The prefrontal cortex is part of the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is big thing this way, and then the prefrontal cortex involves portions of the brain, many of them right in here, and they are involved in something, I haven't used the term yet, executive function. Executive function means I give you a 5-part puzzle. You have to do X before you can get to Y, and then when you get to Y, you have to do something to it. So a complex task, cooking an egg, getting the egg, putting water in the pot or whatever, turning it on, turning it off. They're all steps, and you can't get to step 4 until you've done step 3, 2, and 1. So executive function is organizational, but it's also suppression of just simple things that would interfere with the task. So if you hear a noise while you're toasting a marshmallow, you don't turn and say, what was that? And your marshmallow burns. All right? So that's an example of how a portion of your brain is suppressing. And that's the difference, really. I mean, if you want to talk about mind, part of what mind does. Our mind helps us to think, but our mind helps us to plan. Our mind, separates us from animals. Animals will act reflexively. And I'll show you some parts of the brain that are considered to be more primitive. And the frontal lobes help to suppress the function of the more primitive parts.